Hello, hello, and welcome to Focus Session 5. Everybody joining us online, here in the room, welcome. Glad you guys are here tonight. Uh, we are continuing our study, and we're going to hop right in because I promised that tonight was going to be, it's played out. It's a trope at this point. Hopefully, it'll be around 15 minutes when I get done teaching tonight. But you know what? I'm going to give myself freedom tonight to run over because this is one of the, at least to me, most interesting and poignant and concrete things that we're looking at. Last week, we looked at joy and how the emotions, when they're controlled by Christ, they lead us to a place of joy. Tonight, we're looking at one of the most persnickety, probably one of the hardest to kind of get our hands around and control aspects of the soul, and that's the will. And what's interesting about the will is that when it's controlled by Christ, it leads to obedience. It leads to obedience that is inspired by love. Ultimately, it makes a big difference in the world. It's one of the factors by which people that don't follow Jesus may stand up at attention to how our lives are different or seem to be under command of something that is altogether bigger than us because we're doing things that we probably couldn't possibly do in our own strength. But part of the problem is that the will is such a tenacious enemy many times to what we actually are trying to achieve in our lives. And what's interesting is you can tell that even just by going back to our diagram that we've looked at over the last several weeks. So the mind is, when controlled by Christ, produces peace. The emotions, when controlled by Christ, produces joy. And so here we reach the will tonight. And so what is the will when it is controlled by Christ? Well, it leads to obedience. But what's interesting is if you're like me, many times the problem that we find is, well, we can have the right mindset about a behavior. We can have feel good about that decision. And then ultimately still make the wrong decision, right? So we can know that running or jogging is good for us, right? We can know that we feel good once we get to the end of a run on any given day. And then when it comes down to it, we don't wake up early or we stay on the couch and watch football on a Saturday. Why? Because that is what our will wanted to do. It's just kind of how we ended up. And what's interesting is in this process, the scriptures describe, there's actually a word in the Greek for what is described as the will. And that word is thelema. Okay, Thelema. And what that word means in the Greek is desire. And so in a lot of ways, in the biblical mindset, the will is a bundle. It's the bundle of desires within us. And what's interesting is that bundle is pretty thickly knit together, right? It's made up of our thoughts, it's made up of our emotions, but it's also made up of our instincts and some of maybe our secret desires, some of the things that we don't even want to admit to ourselves we want are nestled and deeply woven into what is our will. And so thelema is the word that they use in Greek. And here's an example of its usage in the scriptures. In Romans 1:21, it says this: "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptile. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts." In Romans 1, it's interesting because it introduces several aspects of that soul layer that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, right? It says they neither glorified him nor gave him thanks, but their thinking, right, became futile. So their thinking was actually influenced by their desires, the thelema, the will. And God gave them over to this nest, this working, this patchwork of desires that was ultimately sinful in their hearts. And so what we realize is many times in this conversation, our will could be secretly opposed or openly opposed to some of the decisions that we're trying to make elsewhere in our soul. And so it may be a common occurrence as we're trying to work through this process that you go, man, I've really got this figured out, and you still fail. Or I feel really good about where I'm going right now, and you still fail. Because when it comes to the will really is a deciding factor in what we do in regards to obedience. Obedience. And so tonight we're going to look at, okay, what does it look like to begin to give control of that bundle of desires, the thelema, to Christ? So what does it look like to have a will that is controlled by Christ? Or to say it a different way, we must learn to obey by faith. Obey by faith, believing that Christ is in you and allowing him to live out obedience through you to his Father. So living out obedience through you, Christ is going to live out obedience through you for his Father. So where do we start? Well, the first thing we have to realize in this conversation of giving over our will, letting our will be controlled by Christ, is that first we died with Christ. First, we have to realize that we, right, if you remember, if you go all the way back to week 1, the me was at the center of who we are. We died with Christ in salvation. The reason the core of us is now Christ is because we went away. Romans 6:6 says it this way: for we know that our old self was crucified, that's why we have a cross right here at the center, was crucified with him so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. Because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. The Bible explains that when Jesus died on the cross for our sins, our evil decisions and choices and identity died with him. And now our identity is to be controlled by his priorities and his plans. So we gave our lives and our identities and our desires over on the cross. Paul says it like this in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified, right? Instrument of death. I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live. Christ lives in me. Christ lives in me. Which leads us to the second point. Second, he, not me, now lives in my body. Inside this body of death, the Christ of life has come. See, what's key in understanding that Christ is going to control our will is that our desires have to die with Christ. His cross is our cross. 2,000 years ago, when Christ went to the cross to pay for our sins, it wasn't some big picture idea. It wasn't some pie in the sky dream. In a real sense, Christ was the atonement. He was the sacrifice for your and my evil desires. And just as he died, we died with him. And so your evil desires and evil sinfulness and your identity is no more. Now, the scriptures tell us that when someone dies, they're set free. They go beyond the decisions they've made in life. And what's we're banking on as Christians, what we're leaning into in the process of salvation is this next step. Going back to the passages, this is what it says in 2 Corinthians 5:20. It says, now we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Verse 21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. Or Romans 8:11 says it this way, and if the spirit of him, Jesus, who was raised from the dead, is living in you, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. Now, this is getting pretty dense, getting pretty complicated, but this is the thing that's happening is once you believe that you died on the cross, you can't really explain your existence because you died. Your personhood, your identity, ultimately really your dreams, your purpose died with Christ. But the reason we choose to die is because we're banking that something will happen in us that once Christ died became commonplace among believers, but until Christ died had never happened before, which is someone that willingly gives themselves over to Jesus experiences the same resurrection power that raised Jesus from the grave. And so when we die to ourselves and die to our will and give ourselves over to Christ's plans and priority, what does this verse say in Romans 8:11? It says, now the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you. And he will also give life to your mortal bodies because his Spirit lives in you. And so what we're banking on is that we are dying to our old life that will inevitably give way, that will inevitably die in and of its own right because of the sinful decisions that we made, the morally ill decisions that we made that bring about our death because sin brings death. And giving that dead sacrifice life over to the resurrected power of the Son of God inside of us. This is the key to giving the will over to Jesus. If you want to obey, you've got to realize you're dead. So what does that mean? Well, in a real concrete way, what that means is the reason you're no longer controlled by your will is because your will is dead, and the best thing you can do now is keep the way clean and keep the way paved for God's will to express himself through you. Because it goes back again, how do we do it? Well, where's my marker? You probably know by now, we surrender, we renew, and we make war. We surrender to God's will. We renew that it is the best way, that really in this case, it is the only thing that can be made perfect inside of us. The only other option would be to take up our dead will, which we know leads to death, or ultimately we can't complete. And then finally, we make war to keep his will priority in our life so that we can see it come through in its fulfillment and its completion. And so we surrender, we renew, and we make war for the will of God in our lives. And so we begin to obey, don't miss it, because not we are trying harder, not that we've got good information this time and we had bad information the last time and now we're going to make an informed decision. No, the reason we ultimately, truly, foundationally obey is because we are going to let God's will express itself through us in obedience. Going back to what we learned over the last few weeks. How do we obey? Well, we follow Jesus in the same way that we accepted him, through faith, right? This is the verse that we've been wrestling with. Just as you received Christ Jesus, continue to live in him. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. So we obey by faith. We obey by faith. Do you ever wonder how Abraham could navigate a situation where all intents and purposes seemed like he was going to murder his son unto righteousness? It's because he was obeying by faith. You know what the writer of Hebrews commended Abraham for? obeying by faith. See, because there are going to be moments in your life where everything screams at you, your logic, your self-preservation, your moments. I'm not talking about the evil versus good moments. Some of those are going to be pretty clear. I'm talking about the moments where you really want to make an impact and make a change and lean into what Christ has for you. Some of those moments are going to be very, very murky and very hard to translate. And the only way we have any hope of seeing them be successful is we obey by faith. I'll give you two concrete examples, and we're going to be done for tonight. The first is in Luke 22, verse 41. This is Jesus. And this is what it says. Because when it comes to obeying by faith, we've got to be self-aware. We've got to be obeying and realize, okay, are we seeking Christ's or God's will in this situation? And so this is Jesus in this moment. Luke 22, verse 41. He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them. That was the disciples. He knelt down and he prayed. Jesus is in the garden. He says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet, not my will, but yours be done. In this very small microcosm of a verse, you get surrender, renew, and warfare, right? In this moment, you hear Jesus say something. He says, God, my desire is contradictory to your will in this moment. If you can do it, I would prefer not to go to the cross. I would like for my will is not to die on the cross, but ultimately much deeper and much stronger, my will is to do your will. So he renews, right? And then he makes war. Not my will, but yours be done in me. So Jesus in this moment surrenders, he renews, and he makes war so that he can obey by faith. Again, another example of if you were the Messiah, you would probably not be reasoning out a way for you to go die a murderer's death on a cross. It wasn't clear in this moment, but Jesus was choosing to obey by faith. Another example, maybe a more real-world example, from Paul in Philippians 1:23, it says this. Paul says, verse 23, I am torn between the two. Ever felt torn between two situations where you're trying to figure out what God's trying to do? I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith. So what's Paul saying in this moment? Okay, what I want to do is I'm ready to give up on this thing. Not, failure, but I'm ready to go be with Jesus. I've kind of like earned being with Jesus. Let's be honest, a lot of these Romans, they stink. I want to go be with Jesus, but I surrender. It is better for you that I remain. So, making up my mind in this, I'm going to do what Christ has always wanted me to do. So he renews, and then he makes war. Convinced of this, we're going to change things. What he says like this in the verse says, I will continue with all of you for your progress and your joy in the faith. So what? He's committed in making war to make a difference in the will of what God is calling him to do as he obeys by faith. So to summarize this, over and over again, day in and day out, and moment by moment, hour by hour, whatever is required in each day, we have to surrender our will to Christ. We have to renew that Christ's way is most important. And we have to make war in leaving our will aside. Because you may say, well, I really want to do this. Well, are you dead or are you alive? Because if you want the resurrective power of the Son of God to work through you, then we have already been crucified with Christ. And the promise is his resurrective spirit lives within us to make all the difference in the world. And really, you can simplify it down as we close tonight. John 14:10 says this. So what actually did Jesus constantly do? John 14:10 says it like this. This is another definition of obeying by faith. Verse 10, don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. And this is the key right here. Rather, it is the Father living in me. It is the Father living in me who is doing his work. See, it was the Father in Jesus doing the work. As it is now, the Son who is doing the same thing in you and me. And so the call for each of us is to realize that Jesus will equip and empower us to make a difference in the world as we obey in the same way that we received. And this is how our will dies and we are empowered to live differently. We're not called to struggle against the old behaviors. We are called to let them die and take up Christ's behaviors as we live out the new creation that he has made us to be.